Cheryl, the new HOA president, stands on Doug's porch demanding to see his lease. Doug quietly hands her the deed instead. She stared at the paper like it was a foreign language. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge just tight enough to bend it, but not tear. The logo in the corner read Yavapai County Recorder's Office. Doug let the silence stretch. "This is unexpected," she said finally, blinking. Doug tipped his thermos in a half-toast. "That's ownership for you." Full of surprises. The early spring light filtered through the mesquites along the edge of his orchard, casting soft shadows on the porch. A mourning dove cooed lazily. Doug watched Cheryl's jaw tense, then unclench with careful control. She offered a tight smile, no teeth, and turned on her heel without another word, heels tapping down the stone path with military precision. Across the street, Helen stood on her porch in house slippers, a half-finished mug of coffee steaming in her hand. She didn't call out, just raised the cup slightly. Doug answered with a slow nod, the kind that said, "Here it goes again." He watched as Cheryl disappeared around the corner, her clipboard tucked under one arm like a shield. Doug stayed standing for a moment longer, listening to the birdsong and the creak of his old rocking chair behind him. The breeze carried with it the smell of citrus blossom and something else, change. It hadn't always been like this. Silvergate Springs used to be the kind of place where folks argued about tomatoes, not technicalities. Doug remembered a time when the biggest scandal was who forgot to bring deviled eggs to the potluck. But then came the newsletters. And the meetings. And the votes on mailbox colors. Somewhere along the line, his quiet corner of Arizona had been subdivided into rules and roles. He hadn't attended the meeting where Cheryl got elected. He didn't even know there was a vote until Helen showed up with cinnamon rolls and a grimace. She won by default, she'd said. Only 3 people showed up. One thought it was a raffle. Doug had chuckled at the time. It didn't seem like something worth worrying about. He kept to himself. His house sat just outside the official HOA boundary, grandfathered in, but near enough that Cheryl seemed to think he was fair game. The first note she left was passive. The second was pointed. By the third, Doug knew she wasn't going to back off. He went inside and opened the drawer next to the sink. Inside were years of neatly folded paper, receipts, warranty cards, user manuals. He pulled out the one labeled deed. Smooth, firm, original. His father's name was still on the first line, crossed out in blue ink from the transfer. He looked at his own name typed below it, the ink slightly faded but still clear. By the end of the afternoon, that deed was displayed in his front window, framed in painter's tape and dignity. Underneath it, Doug had stuck a yellow post-it with just 2 words, "Still mine." Helen passed by later that evening, walking her small terrier, Baxter, who barked once at the display. "Didn't think it'd come to this," she said. Doug nodded. "Didn't think a lemon tree would survive the frost either, but here we are." For 2 days, there was silence. No notes. No visits. Just spring in full swing, the fig trees leafing out, bees beginning their slow hum. Doug returned to pruning. He cleaned out the bird feeders. He drank coffee on the porch and didn't think too hard. Then, on the 3rd morning, it showed up. A square envelope, cream-colored and far too thick to be casual, was pinned to the wooden gate by a gold thumbtack. Doug pulled it off and turned it over in his hands. Printed in bold at the top. Friendly reminder, residents are encouraged to conform with updated landscaping aesthetics to reflect HOA unity values. Doug read it twice, then once more for the sheer absurdity. He glanced toward the orchard, where his apple tree leaned slightly, stubborn and fruitless but loyal. A friendly reminder HOA notice is pinned to Doug's gate the next day. Doug finds orange surveyor flags poking through his orchard. He wasn't notified. At first he thought they were markers from a neighborhood kid's scavenger hunt. Bright orange plastic, fluttering in the breeze, spaced in an odd arc that sliced across the southern edge of his land. The orchard grass had just begun greening after its winter hibernation, and the flags looked like warning signs for something nobody bothered to warn him about. He followed the line. It curved sharply past the leaning apple tree, ducked under the low boughs of a fig, and ended abruptly near his compost bin. There, a laminated tag read, Silvergate Springs Drainage Phase 2. Doug squatted and rubbed the back of his neck. It was still early, the sun not yet fully above the ridge, but the desert air carried a dry confidence. Somewhere in the distance, a leaf blower started its morning whine. Down the street, a white municipal van eased into view. Two men in neon vests and wide-brimmed hats stepped out and began uncoiling measuring tape, one tapping away on a tablet. Doug made his way over, boots crunching through gravel, the edge of his flannel shirt brushing freshly trimmed branches. When he reached them, he didn't smile. "Morning," he said. One of the men looked up, expression blank beneath mirrored sunglasses. "Morning, sir." Doug pointed toward the flags. "Those on your to-do list?" The man checked his clipboard. "Drainage line improvement. Community-wide. Just marking the grade for the new trench route." Doug folded his arms. "That's my orchard." The other man, younger, less seasoned, offered a half-shrug. "We just follow the markings, sir. HOA signed off. Permits already pulled." Doug raised an eyebrow. "Who signed off for my land?" Neither answered. Instead, they returned to their measurements, quiet and efficient. Doug stood still a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the house. At June's diner, the coffee was strong and the conversation stronger. Doug slid into the booth opposite Helen, who was already buttering a biscuit with mechanical grace. "You look like a man who just saw his property line violated," she said without looking up. Doug poured cream into his mug. "How do you always know before I do?" "Because I still read the HOA bulletins." She set the knife down. "This week's edition says something about runoff management synergy. You're synergy now." Doug sipped his coffee. It tasted like burnt soil and memory. Marge, the 70-something waitress with a bouffant held up by more faith than pins, came by with a wink and a refill. "You bring trouble into my diner, Douglas." He smiled. "Just absorbing it, Marge." Helen leaned in. "When they start measuring, they're aiming to take." Doug nodded slowly, thinking of the orange flags, the tablet, the nonchalant clipboards. He folded his napkin neatly and stood. "Where you going?" Helen asked. "To visit the county office," Doug said. "Maybe file something of my own." By the time he returned home that afternoon, a row of flags had doubled in number. A new sign was posted on a short metal stake, "Work begins Friday, expect noise and disruption." Friday came. And so did the crew. They didn't knock. The backhoe rolled in just after sunrise, tires pressing deep into the edge of Doug's orchard, scarring the soil he'd turned by hand each spring for years. The men worked fast, helmets low, their movements practiced. They cut a trench like a scar through earth that once bore fruit and shade. Roots snapped. One plum tree shivered, its trunk exposed like it had been peeled. Doug didn't shout. He walked down the slope with calm, phone in hand, recording. The foreman gave him the same answer, "HOA approved." "Nothing we can do." He watched a fig's feeder roots tear in a way that made him flinch, then turned away. The next morning, a new envelope arrived, this time pinned neatly to his front gate with the same gold thumbtack as before. Inside was a printed document bearing the HOA seal. It read, "Resident Wexler has been noted to engage in practices of malicious irrigation behavior, including non-compliant redirection of groundwater." A new HOA notice arrives accusing Doug of malicious irrigation behavior. Doug finds a fresh concrete pipe shoved through his fence, without consent. The morning had started the same as any other, birdsong, black coffee, and the rustling whisper of fig leaves catching the desert breeze. But when Doug stepped out to check the compost bin, something was off. It wasn't the way the light hit the orchard or the silence of the wind. It was the low, unnatural hum. He followed the sound to the back corner of his land and froze. There, cutting through his wooden fence like a bayonet through canvas, was a concrete pipe. It gleamed faintly with moisture, wedged in with brutal confidence. PVC sealed to concrete, fitted so snug it looked permanent, designed to carry water in only one direction. His direction. Doug didn't shout. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, hand gripping the fence post until his knuckles whitened. He reached for his phone, snapped photos from every angle, then climbed back through the orchard in silence. Inside, he unfolded the old survey map from when he'd first bought the land. The margins were worn, corners soft from years of handling, but the lines were clear. His fence line was true. The pipe was not. He pulled open a drawer beneath the kitchen counter and slipped out a folded yellowed paper, his father's writing in blocky penmanship, "Own your land. Guard it. Water always remembers." Doug set the paper beside the deed and stared out the window at the trees he had planted with gloved hands and calloused faith. A fig tree bent slightly in the wind, like it knew something was coming. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Eli," he said when the line picked up. "You still playing with topographic maps?" A pause, then a laugh. "You offering me a job or a riddle?" Doug explained. "The pipe. The flags. The trench. The silence." Eli arrived 2 days later in a faded blue pickup, cooler in the back seat, laser level on the dash, and a dry joke about gravity waiting on his tongue. He shook Doug's hand, then walked the perimeter with slow, deliberate steps. "They're using your land like a sponge," Eli said. "And from the looks of it, they never planned for overflow. No fail-safe. No outflow. Just absorption." Doug nodded. "I don't want revenge. I want correction." Eli cracked a grin. "We can do both." They spread the old survey map on Doug's kitchen table, layered it with new satellite prints, and began marking gradient angles with pencils and string. The plan was simple in structure, elegant in spite. Doug visited the permit office the next morning, hat low and tone mild. He requested a minor landscaping update, soil reinforcement and erosion mitigation. The clerk barely glanced up before stamping the form. Back home, they began assembling materials. Gravel. Perforated pipe. Geotextile fabric. Nothing that raised suspicion. All legitimate. All within guidelines. Just improvements, as the form said. That night, the digging began. Eli and Doug worked under headlamps, speaking only when necessary. The soil was stubborn from drought but softened with purpose. Each shovel load moved with care, angled just so, sloped toward a truth no one else could see. They laid the pipe beneath the orchard's skin, burying it like a secret. Water would come, and when it did, it would remember. Doug planted his boots deep into the trench as he set the final elbow of pipe. The moon overhead watched without comment. The wind carried the scent of citrus and loam. His hands, coated in clay, gripped the gravel like resolve. They tamped the earth down slowly, masking every trace of rebellion beneath mulch and native plantings. By dawn, the orchard looked untouched, just another patch of Arizona trying to survive spring. As Doug rinsed the dirt from his hands and leaned against the fence, his old radio on the porch crackled to life. "Record rainfall approaching Arizona valleys," the announcer said, voice steady. "Flash flood warnings in effect for Prescott County and surrounding rural areas. Radio forecast announces, record rainfall approaching Arizona valleys." A new HOA letter warns Doug about disruptive drainage modifications. Doug tucks it into his pocket, smiling. He didn't bother reading the rest of it. The envelope had weight, the kind designed to intimidate, a heavy stock printed with HOA branding and just enough legal language to make most people sweat. Doug folded it cleanly, tucked it next to the screwdriver in his back pocket, and walked back to the shed. The late afternoon sky had slipped into indigo, the kind of fading light that softened the edges of everything. Doug checked the supplies again, bags of gravel stacked like quiet promises, coils of flexible pipe looped like hibernating snakes, buckets of native soil. Inside the house, the kitchen table was still cluttered with maps and highlighted code sections. The permit form, stamped and dated, sat in a manila folder marked soil reinforcement, non-structural. Nothing about drainage. Nothing to raise eyebrows. He stepped back outside as Eli's truck rolled up, tires crackling over the gravel drive. Eli killed the engine and got out, stretching like a cat. "You ready to make gravity our partner?" Doug handed him a headlamp. "Hope she's in a generous mood." By the time the sun dipped completely behind the ridge, they were both waist-deep in a trench that followed the natural slope of the orchard. The night came quietly, crickets tuning their chorus as they worked. The rhythm of shovels and breath was slow, deliberate. They didn't talk much, just nodded, adjusted, checked levels. Somewhere in the distance, a truck passed on the highway, the sound faint and lonesome. Helen appeared just after 9, wrapped in a sweater, carrying 2 mason jars of lemon tea. She didn't say a word about the trench or the bags of gravel or the headlamps. She just handed each of them a jar and leaned on the fence. "My father used to say," she murmured, "your father would have buried a pipe and a secret, same day." Doug chuckled softly. Eli lifted his jar in mock salute. "Then we're doing him proud." Helen sipped her tea and stayed for a few minutes, watching the work without comment. When she left, she patted Doug on the shoulder, not approval, not pity, just a quiet kind of faith. The digging continued until nearly midnight. They layered the trench, gravel, pipe, more gravel, then earth. Eli measured the gradient twice, ensuring that every drop of water would obey the plan without protest. When they finally stepped back, the orchard looked undisturbed. No jagged cuts, no exposed pipe. Just soil, slightly darker, textured with care. Doug stood at the edge, boots dusty, hands stiff. He could smell the clay, the citrus leaves above, the earth holding its breath. The moon peeked through clouds, casting silver light over the fig tree and the stubborn old apple. "Looks untouched," Eli said. "That's the point," Doug replied. They packed the tools and said nothing on the way back to the house. The next morning, Doug opened the mailbox and found a certified envelope nestled between a gardening flyer and a coupon booklet. Same letterhead. Same tone. "You will be held personally liable for future water damage. A certified HOA letter arrives. You will be held personally liable for future water damage." First thunder echoes over Silvergate. Doug sits under the porch eave, sipping diner coffee in a thermos. The sky had been sulking all afternoon, a smudge of gray rolling in from the south with the slow certainty of someone who knows they're about to win an argument. Doug sat with his boots propped on the second step, the steam from his coffee curling up into the thickening air. The tin thermos still carried the faint scent of bacon grease. Marge had poured it full and winked without asking. He took a long sip and muttered to no one in particular, "Liable? Let's test that." Across the cul-de-sac, Easter streamers fluttered half-heartedly from folding tent poles. The HOA's annual picnic was in full swing, bright plastic eggs tucked beneath hedges, paper plates stacked near tubs of potato salad. Children darted through the lawn with baskets clutched like treasure, laughter mingling with the occasional parent calling out a name. Cheryl, wearing a pastel blouse and the kind of grin that stiffens under pressure, stood near the podium, ready to give what Doug guessed would be an inspirational speech about community stewardship. He watched as Helen quietly passed out ponchos from a tote bag. The older neighbors had brought their lawn chairs, the ones with frayed straps and initials painted on the underside. They sat in a loose semicircle, murmuring to one another, eyes drifting between the clouds and Cheryl's clipboard. The first drops were soft, tentative taps on tarp roofs, gentle splashes on sidewalk edges. Cheryl pressed on with her speech, talking louder as the wind picked up. Doug leaned back in his chair, tightened the thermos cap, and waited. Rain turned from polite to impatient. In minutes, the wind began to bend the trees, and water pooled at the edges of the HOA's new trench system. Doug could see it from where he sat, the concrete line glistening, a clean-cut channel stretching along the subdivision's edge, funneling runoff with smug efficiency. The catch basin at the far end gurgled once, then backed up. Leaves clung to the metal grate like barnacles. Bark mulch from the decorative beds swirled and clumped. A child shrieked, not from fear, just surprise, as a burst of water splashed their sneakers. Doug set the thermos beside him and stood. He stepped off the porch and walked a few paces to the edge of his orchard. Water crept toward his property like a careful guest. It hit the edge, disappeared beneath the surface with barely a sound, absorbed into the hidden French drain like it had always belonged. A moment passed. Then, across the street, it began to rise. Water re-emerged in the HOA's lower lots, silent and sudden. It surged through narrow flower beds and under patio furniture. Plastic eggs floated like escaped ornaments. The trench had done its job, redirected everything downhill, except it hadn't accounted for what waited underground on Doug's side. Doug didn't move. He didn't smile. He watched. Cheryl's speech stopped mid-sentence as someone pointed. Her expression flickered, concern, then disbelief, then panic. Her shoes, carefully chosen for the spring theme, were already soaked. She called out to volunteers, gesturing wildly. Helen, still handing out ponchos, paused and said quietly to an elderly couple beside her, told them. Doug's eyes followed a slow swirl of bark mulch drifting toward Ron's lot. The model train man had just replaced his flower bed edging with reclaimed brick. He was now using a broom to push water away from the garage door, muttering words Doug couldn't hear but could guess. Then the Lexus moved. It didn't jerk or slide. It glided, quiet, inevitable, down the slope of Cheryl's driveway. The rear tires lifted slightly as the water pooled deeper beneath them. The car rolled past her azaleas, dipped its nose, and bumped gently against Ron's birdbath, which toppled with a splash. Cheryl's voice cracked as she screamed something into her phone, pacing back and forth in water up to her ankles. She spun, pointed at Doug's yard, then waved her arms at the HOA's trench like it had betrayed her. Helen filmed from her window. Cheryl screams into her phone, "Get Public Works out here, now." Whose bright idea was this trench system? A city inspector asks dryly. He stood ankle-deep in mud, clipboard slick with drizzle, safety vest streaked with brown from a misstep near Ron's mailbox. The sun had barely crested over the hills, casting a milky light that made the whole of Silvergate Springs look like a watercolor left out in the rain. Doug sipped coffee from his thermos and pointed politely. "I believe that would be HOA Initiative #22-1. The inspector huffed and scribbled something. Behind him, a crew in rubber boots poked at a collapsed catch basin with poles and muttered curses about grading and runoff. Cheryl was nowhere in sight. Helen joined Doug on his porch, holding a paper bag from the diner. "Got you a biscuit before the line formed." They ran out of sausage by 7. Doug took it with a nod. "Looks like we're not the only ones cleaning up." Across the cul-de-sac, tulips lay flattened, bright petals drowned in sludge. Lawn chairs and plastic eggs from the picnic had collected against chain-link fences like driftwood. The walking trail was submerged under 3 inches of gritty water, and someone's porch swing floated near a storm drain like a ghost of suburban peace. Helen pulled out her phone and opened the Silvergate Seniors group chat. Posting the rest of the photos, she said, swiping. "Got a good one of Ron yelling at that HOA guy with the bad mustache." Doug chuckled. "He deserves a medal. Ron certainly earned it." By mid-morning, the model train enthusiast had rallied a small army, mostly retirees and part-time gardeners, who were sick of being fined for mailboxes and mulch while their garages filled with stormwater. He paced the sidewalk with a bullhorn borrowed from his grandson and a flyer in hand that read, "Down with Drain Queen." By noon, someone had spray-painted those exact words in looping purple letters across Cheryl's garage door. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. The HOA's official inbox was flooded, this time with emails. Insurance adjusters responded with polite rejections. The system, they said, had not followed city drainage protocol. No liability would be assumed. The deductible for damage would fall on the HOA's emergency fund, which, as Helen noted, had recently been used to purchase decorative lampposts and a new welcome sign. Cheryl, perhaps sensing the turn of the tide, announced an emergency board meeting via a group email with urgent subject lines and 3 exclamation points. 4 people showed up. 2 left before the end. 1 brought a Tupperware of potato salad but no fork. Doug stayed home. He didn't need to be there. Things had already started to collapse without him. Later that evening, as cicadas began to hum and the smell of soaked bark settled over the neighborhood, an HOA board member named Cheryl, with a C, forwarded the original trench schematics to the entire community mailing list. Along with it, she added a note. Attached are the original documents for transparency. I can no longer support the current board. The replies came in waves. Residents who had never spoken now compared damages. Photos were attached. Legal threats were hinted. The mood shifted from grumbling to movement. Doug stepped out to water the newly recovered apple tree, the soil still damp but no longer sour. He knelt beside it, thumbed a new shoot, and smiled at its stubbornness. When he returned to the porch, a slip of paper had been wedged under the door. Not an envelope, just a half-page folded once, no name on the outside. Inside, printed neatly in bold font, were 5 words. We need to talk urgently, Cheryl. Doug finds a note slipped under his door. We need to talk urgently, Cheryl. Doug steps onto Cheryl's porch. She opens the door in a hoodie, eyes rimmed red, voice small, we need your help. He didn't say anything right away. The porch boards creaked beneath his weight, a sound that felt louder than it was in the stillness of the morning. A tattered HOA flyer clung wetly to the screen door behind her, edges curled like a flower wilting in reverse. Cheryl's voice barely made it through the gap. She looked smaller somehow, no clipboard, no makeup, no armor. Her hoodie was damp at the cuffs, and her hair hung in soft, directionless strands. We're being fined, she continued, voice cracking on the second word. The city won't renew our drainage permit unless the original landholder, you, approve the corrective redesign. They're threatening lawsuits, liens. The whole system's flagged as a hazard. We need your cooperation. Doug stepped one pace forward but didn't cross the threshold. Rain had left splotches on the concrete, and her decorative garden pebbles were scattered across the path like forgotten intentions. Lawn signs leaned at odd angles, and the planter box she'd once filled with seasonal tulips was now just mud and broken stems. He looked at her, not harshly, not pitying, just looked. Across the street, Helen watched from her porch with her knitting in hand, one foot on a stool. She didn't speak either. I didn't mean for this to happen, Cheryl said. We were trying to improve things. Build something. I didn't know. Doug's head tilted slightly. You didn't ask. We're all neighbors, she tried. We're in this together. That was when he heard it again, not from her lips but somewhere tucked deep in his memory. His father's voice, low and steady, don't give a hand to the one who pulled your roots. Doug stepped back. You should have left the orchard alone, he said, each word placed like a stone. Then he turned, boots thudding against the porch, and walked down the path without looking back. Cheryl didn't follow. She stood there in her doorway, arms crossed tight, watching the space where he had been. The resignations began that afternoon. One by one, the HOA board members submitted brief statements, some citing stress, others citing unforeseen liability complications. The email thread grew until even Cheryl with a C sent her farewell, attaching a spreadsheet of unreimbursed HOA spending for transparency. It was the loudest silence Doug had ever read. That evening, Helen dropped off a container of lemon bars and said nothing except, "You didn't gloat. That matters." He nodded, thumbed the plastic lid shut, and returned to his shed. Inside, taped neatly above the workbench and next to a wooden plaque that read, "Don't start none, won't be none," he pinned a single sheet of paper. Bold font. All caps. Effective immediately, I resign as president of Silvergate Springs HOA. Doug prints Cheryl's final line, effective immediately, I resign as president of Silvergate Springs HOA, and pins it in his toolshed. A kid bikes past Doug's gate and calls, "Hey, aren't you the guy who flooded the HOA?" Doug looked up from the patch of soil he was loosening and gave the kid a slow smile. He wiped a forearm across his brow, leaning on the handle of the spade. "I prefer neighborhood hydrologist," he said. The kid let out a bark of laughter and pedaled on, tires crackling on the crushed granite path. Doug watched him go, then turned back to the soil. The fig trees rustled gently overhead, their branches heavy with the green promise of fruit. It was a good morning to be quiet. The orchard was recovering. Not perfectly, there were still bare spots and stumps where his favorite plums once stood, but life had taken root again. A new sapling, barely hip-high, trembled under a slow breeze. Doug crouched to check the moisture, pressing his fingers into the dirt. Damp, but not soaked. The balance was coming back. Late morning sun cast a golden hue across the porch as Doug loaded a brown paper bag with 6 pears, still slightly underripe but proud in their own way. He tied the top with string, tucked it under one arm, and made his way toward June's diner. The streets of Silvergate Springs were unusually still, save for the occasional dog walker or neighbor tinkering in a garage. Chalk hopscotch patterns lingered on sidewalks, softened from the last rain but still visible like echoes of children's laughter. Doug passed Cheryl's old house without pausing. The spray paint was gone, but the outline of Drain Queen still faintly clung to the garage door. Her mailbox now bore a handwritten tag, "For sale." At the diner, Marge greeted him with a nod and poured coffee before he even sat. She gestured to the reopened patio. "Nice out today," she said. "Figured you'd want your usual spot." Doug set the bag on the counter. "For you and the staff." Marge peeked inside and smiled. "Pears? They're back." "First batch," Doug said, taking his mug. "Told you they were stubborn." Outside, the cicadas had started up, slow at first, then louder like a soft mechanical applause. Doug sipped and watched the clouds drift behind the ridgeline. It was the kind of day that didn't need anything fixed. Helen arrived 10 minutes later with a wrapped bundle in her arms. She slid it across the table. "I figured you might like this better than another ceramic owl," she said. Doug unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a framed photo of his orchard taken the summer before the flooding, green, full, untouched. A handwritten caption on the back read, "The way it was. The way it will be again." He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded once. "Thanks." By the time he walked home, the streets were warmer, the air thicker. Neighbors waved, not in sympathy but in acknowledgement. The HOA had been restructured, rotating committees now handled decisions, 1 rep per street. Nobody volunteered twice, but nobody avoided it either. They'd asked Doug to join. He had declined. "I'm more of a route guy than a rules guy." In his shed, the scent of old lumber and citrus oil hung in the air. Doug placed the framed resignation letter beside the wooden plaque that read, "Don't start none, won't be none." The paper had yellowed slightly at the corners, but the bolded words still rang clear. He took off his gloves, rinsed his hands, and stepped back outside. The orchard rustled. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang. And Doug, standing under the dappling shade of a fig tree reborn, simply listened. In the quiet that followed the storm, Silvergate Springs found its rhythm again, no longer ruled by flyers and fines, but by front porches and neighborly nods. Doug's orchard, once a battleground, had become a quiet symbol of balance reclaimed. When power is misused, it turns roots to rubble, but when people stand their ground with patience and principle, even the deepest trenches can be undone. Like water finding its path home, justice has a way of returning, quietly, steadily, and right on time. Perhaps all it takes is one person planting something worth protecting.